The war was nearly over, but no one dared to say it out loud. In the rolling hills of southern Germany, the sounds of battle had become sporadic, almost reluctant, like echoes from a dying machine. American soldiers patrolled abandoned villages with caution, wary of ambushes from desperate holdouts, remnants of the Volkssturm, often no more than boys with outdated weapons and fear in their eyes. Sergeant Michael Hendricks moved silently along the edge of a crumbling stone wall. He had seen enough death to last a lifetime. North Africa, Normandy, Bastogne. But something about these final days unsettled him. The enemy no longer looked like men. They looked like frightened children. And every time he saw one through the scope, he hesitated just a little longer. The village they entered was nearly deserted. Smoke rose from chimneys that no longer burned wood but furniture. Doors swung loosely on hinges. A dog barked in the distance, then whimpered and fell silent. Michael raised his hand, signaling his squad to stop. His eyes were fixed on a small farmhouse at the far end of the street, its windows broken, the roof partially collapsed. There was movement. He gestured again, this time toward the barn behind the house. Private Jennings flanked left, while Corporal Davis and Private Ruiz took the right. Michael approached directly, stepping carefully over debris. He didn't want another firefight. Not today. Not with the war all but over. Not with the rumors that Berlin had fallen and Hitler was dead. Outside the barn was a root cellar, its heavy wooden door slightly ajar. Michael stopped 3 feet away and listened. Breathing, muffled and rapid. Someone was inside. He pulled his rifle strap over his shoulder but didn't raise the weapon. Instead, he took one cautious step forward and spoke. "Hello? Anyone inside? You don't have to be afraid." His voice was steady, practiced, but kind. He repeated himself in German, slow and deliberate. "Keine Angst, wir tun euch nichts. No fear, we won't hurt you." His accent was poor, but the message was clear. There was silence. Then a whisper, too low to interpret. Michael crouched and laid his rifle on the ground. He raised both hands. Behind him, Jennings tensed. The squad watched in nervous stillness. Michael didn't move again, just kept his voice calm. "It's safe now. The war is over. You're just kids. We won't hurt you." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the cellar door creaked open. A pair of frightened eyes appeared in the shadow, then a thin hand gripping the edge of the door. A boy, no older than 10, emerged, dirty, trembling, hollow-cheeked. Behind him, another figure moved, older, 14, maybe 15, his posture rigid, his jaw clenched. He stepped into the light, and Michael's heart sank. The boy was armed. In the teenager's right hand was a revolver, partially obscured by the sleeve of his too large coat. Michael saw it instantly, and so did the others. The squad's rifles shifted slightly. Fingers curled closer to triggers. The tension snapped back into the air like a taut wire. Michael didn't flinch. He lifted one hand higher and shouted, "Don't shoot! Everyone, hold your fire!" The boy with the revolver froze. Their eyes met across a dozen yards. The boy's hand twitched, and in that instant, the moment that hung between fear and hope, the shot rang out. The gunshot tore through the silence like a blade. For a split second, everything froze. The birds in the trees, the wind against the barn, even the squad's breath. Then Sergeant Hendricks staggered backward, clutching his stomach as a dark stain bloomed across his uniform. He crumpled to his knees, his mouth open in a silent gasp of pain. Private Jennings instinctively raised his rifle. The older boy was still standing, arm extended, eyes wide in disbelief at what he had done. His body was trembling, his lips parted as if to speak, but no words came.
Michael, still conscious, managed to raise one bloodied hand. "Don't shoot! Don't! He's just a kid!" But it was too late. One of the soldiers fired. The shot hit the boy square in the chest, sending him backward onto the gravel. His revolver clattered from his hand. His legs twitched once, then fell still. The silence returned, but now it was heavy, choking, final, irreversible.
The younger boy screamed. He dropped to the ground beside the fallen teen, clutching his limp arm, crying out in a mix of German and broken sobs. No one could move. Michael tried to speak again, but only a hoarse cough came out. Blood stained his lips. His eyes met the younger boy's for a moment, and something passed between them. Fear, grief, maybe guilt. Corporal Davis knelt beside Michael, desperately applying pressure to the wound. "Stay with us, Sarge. You're gonna be all right." But everyone knew the truth. The bullet had gone deep. The color was draining from Michael's face, but his expression was one of heartbreak, not just pain. "What have you done?" Michael whispered, not in anger, but in sorrow. "He was just a kid, like my Tom." He turned his head slightly, looking toward the boy who was still crying, rocking beside the lifeless body of his friend or brother. No one approached the boy. The rifles were lowered, but the distance remained. Private Ruiz stood motionless, his rifle hanging loosely by his side. "Jesus," he muttered. "He just wanted to surrender." The soldiers weren't angry anymore. They were stunned, shaken. The rules of war didn't prepare them for this, for children with guns and eyes full of fear. A medic arrived and began working on Michael, but the others remained still. Around them, the world continued. Birds chirped, leaves rustled, but the moment hung in the air like smoke. The surviving boy eventually stopped crying. He didn't run, didn't beg, didn't speak. He just sat in the dirt, staring down at his hands, as if unsure they were still part of him. Michael faded in and out of consciousness, his breaths becoming shorter. "Don't blame them," he whispered. "They were scared, same as us." Those were the last full words he would say. The boy's bullet hadn't just pierced his body, it had shattered the fragile trust that had almost been born. The squad looked to their commander, but no one knew what to do next. They hadn't just lost their sergeant, they had lost something else too. Something harder to name, something that felt like hope. The sun had barely moved in the sky, but everything felt older, heavier. Sergeant Hendricks was gone. He died in the field ambulance less than an hour after the shooting, his pulse fading despite the medic's best efforts. The bullet had torn through his abdomen, and though he never cried out, his body gave up quietly. The man who had begged them not to shoot, even after being shot himself, died believing that mercy still mattered. The squad stood in a loose circle, the silence between them thick and oppressive. No one spoke as the medics covered Michael's body with a blanket. Jennings paced nearby, jaw clenched, fists tight. Ruiz sat on a wooden crate, head in hands, whispering a prayer that seemed more for himself than anyone else. Davis just stared at the dirt, eyes vacant. The teenage boy who had pulled the trigger lay nearby, lifeless, his blood seeping into the soil. The revolver had been real. The fear in his eyes had been real too. They all knew he didn't want to shoot, but terror, fed by years of Nazi propaganda, had made him pull the trigger when trust had finally been offered. The younger boy, still in shock, had not moved. He sat next to the body, knees pulled to his chest, arms wrapped tightly around them. His face was pale, streaked with dirt and dried tears. One of the soldiers brought him a blanket, but the boy didn't react. He wasn't crying anymore, just watching the world as if it no longer made sense.
Later that afternoon, the company commander arrived. He asked for a report, and Davis recited the events in flat, clinical terms. 2 enemy combatants emerged from a concealed position. 1 was armed. A shot was fired. 1 friendly casualty, 1 enemy KI, 1 civilian minor detained. It sounded like any other report, but it wasn't. Everyone there knew this wasn't war. It was something worse.
That evening, the remaining men gathered around a small campfire behind the farmhouse. No one mentioned the boy. No one mentioned Michael either. The fire crackled softly while they ate silently from their ration tins. The warmth offered little comfort. There was nothing to say that hadn't already been carved into their memory. Ruiz eventually stood up and walked away from the fire, unable to sit still. He passed the makeshift field grave where Michael's body had been temporarily buried, marked with his helmet and a wooden cross. He stood there for a long time, staring at it, lips moving without sound. Then he turned toward the barn, where the boy was being kept under light guard. Inside the barn, the boy sat on a straw mat, hugging his knees. He didn't sleep. When Ruiz approached, he looked up with the same numb expression. Ruiz didn't speak at first. He just sat down across from him, laying a piece of chocolate on the ground between them. The boy didn't touch it. He just stared. Finally, Ruiz broke the silence. "He tried to save you." The boy said nothing, but his eyes blinked quickly, as if holding back something he didn't understand. In that moment, neither of them knew if forgiveness was possible. They only knew that pain had no side, and that what happened in that field would never fully leave them. The next morning came quietly, without fanfare or color. The trees swayed in a soft wind that smelled of damp earth and ash, and the village remained still, like a place caught between 2 worlds, one that had ended and one that had yet to begin. In the makeshift command tent, the officers discussed troop movements and next objectives, as if the previous day's events could be folded neatly into a tactical report. But for those who had been there, nothing about it was neat. The boy, whose name they finally learned was Lucas, remained in silence. He hadn't eaten, he hadn't slept, he didn't ask questions, and didn't resist orders. One of the guards tried to offer him food again, this time a slice of bread and canned peaches, but Lucas only looked at it blankly, as if he no longer understood what hunger was. He was a child whose entire reality had been ripped apart in an instant. What none of the Americans could fully grasp was what had been fed into Lucas and his dead companion for years. Through radio broadcasts, school lessons, and posters on every street, they had been taught that surrender meant torture, that American soldiers were monsters in human skin. Teachers had told them stories of atrocities. Their youth leaders drilled into them the fear of capture, the nobility of death, and the shame of weakness. Surrender wasn't just discouraged, it was demonized. Michael had seen it in Lucas's eyes the moment the cellar door opened. That look wasn't hatred. It was confusion, terror, and the weight of indoctrination. The revolver hadn't been raised in defiance. It had been the last lifeline of a boy who had been told that mercy didn't exist. To Lucas, trusting a smiling soldier might have felt more dangerous than dying with a gun in hand. In the days that followed, American soldiers searched the village and found more signs of what these children had been taught to believe. Piles of propaganda leaflets warned of enemy brutality. Drawings in school notebooks depicted Americans with horns, bloodied knives, and fanged mouths. One letter, confiscated from a nearby schoolmaster's desk, urged families to keep their sons hidden or arm them for a final stand. It painted a picture of apocalypse. Better to die a German than live as a slave. Ruiz took those leaflets and brought them back to the camp. He spread them out on a table, staring at them in disbelief. "No wonder they're afraid of us," he muttered. The others nodded slowly as the reality sank deeper. They had never stood a chance.
Even when they laid down their rifles, they were still viewed through the lens of lies.
Back in the barn, Lucas finally accepted a small cup of water. His hands were steady now, but his eyes still searched each face that entered, as if bracing for cruelty. When Davis came to relieve the guard that evening, he brought a folded photo from his coat pocket. It was of Michael, holding his 2 kids on a fishing trip in Michigan, smiling in the sun. Davis knelt and showed it to Lucas.
"This was him," he said quietly. "He had a boy just like you." Lucas stared at the photo for a long time, his lips pressed together, his chest rising slowly. He said nothing, but when Davis stood to leave, Lucas held on to the photo just a moment longer before letting it go.
Outside the barn, the sun finally began to break through the clouds. But even the light felt hesitant, unsure how to shine on the pieces left behind.
2 days after the shooting, the squad received orders to move north, but they delayed their departure until the morning. There was unfinished business in the village, something unspoken that none of them wanted to leave behind unresolved. The field grave where Sergeant Hendricks was buried became the center of quiet pilgrimage. Each man came at different times, standing in silence before the wooden cross. No speeches were given, no prayers recited, just silence, the kind that said more than words ever could. Private Ruiz spent the longest there. He knelt in front of the grave and placed the sergeant's helmet on top of the cross. His hands lingered there, as if he could still feel warmth through the cold metal. He whispered something that no one else heard, then stood and turned toward the barn where Lucas remained under watch. Hendricks had believed the boy deserved a chance, and Ruiz couldn't shake the feeling that honoring him meant keeping that belief alive. When Ruiz entered the barn, Lucas was sitting by the small window, watching the sunset. The light cast long golden lines across the straw-covered floor. He looked fragile, almost transparent, like he might disappear if no one spoke to him. Ruiz sat down a few feet away and opened a ration tin. "You should eat," he said softly. Lucas turned his head, hesitant, then reached for it with slow, deliberate movement. He ate quietly, each bite careful, as though the act itself might be taken from him. For the first time, Lucas spoke. His voice was small and uneven, like something unused for too long. "Why didn't he shoot me?" he asked in German. Ruiz understood enough to piece it together. He took a deep breath before answering, searching for words that would make sense in any language. "Because he didn't see an enemy," he said. "He saw a boy, like his own son." Lucas looked down, his hands trembling around the tin. "But I killed him," he whispered. Ruiz didn't respond. There was no correction, no argument, just silence again. Later that evening, the commander called Ruiz to discuss the boy's fate. Some argued he should be sent to a prisoner processing camp. Others thought he should be left with local civilians. Ruiz volunteered to take responsibility until reinforcements arrived. "He's just a kid," he said. "He doesn't belong in a camp." The commander hesitated, but finally agreed, signing the note that made Ruiz personally accountable for the child's safety. As night settled in, Ruiz sat by the fire outside the barn. The other soldiers gathered around him, their faces illuminated by the flickering light. They talked quietly about home, about wives, children, farms, the smell of the ocean. But between their words hung the memory of Michael's voice, that final plea not to shoot. It had changed something in all of them. War no longer felt like victory or duty. It felt like a burden they could never set down. In the early hours before dawn, Lucas came out of the barn and stood by the fire. His eyes were red, his face tired. Ruiz offered him a piece of chocolate, the same kind Hendricks used to hand out to local kids they encountered during patrols. Lucas hesitated, then took it. The sweetness melted slowly on his tongue. For the first time, he allowed himself to look directly at Ruiz without fear. "Danke," he said quietly. Ruiz nodded, unable to trust his own voice.
When morning came, the trucks were ready to move. Lucas climbed into the back of one, sitting between crates of supplies. As they drove away from the village, Ruiz looked back at the small wooden cross disappearing behind the trees. The air was cold, and the world seemed fragile. But somewhere in that silence, he thought he heard Hendricks's voice again, not as a memory, but as truth. Mercy always costs something, but it is never wasted. The convoy rolled slowly through the countryside, leaving behind the village and everything that had happened there. The war was not yet officially over, but for many of the men in that truck, it already felt like something had ended. Not just a campaign or a mission, but a part of themselves. They had seen something raw and irreversible, something that would not fade with distance. Lucas sat quietly, his small frame wedged between crates of blankets and field gear, watching the road disappear behind them. At the next staging camp, Lucas was registered, examined by a medic, and given clean clothes. The military clerks didn't know what to make of him. He was neither prisoner nor refugee. Ruiz stayed close, ensuring he was treated with decency, deflecting questions with short, tired answers. "He's under my care," he repeated. That was all he could say without reopening everything they were all trying to leave behind. Over the next weeks, Lucas began to talk more. Slowly, hesitantly, as if each word might betray him. He didn't speak about the boy who had died. He didn't ask about Sergeant Hendricks. Instead, he asked questions that made Ruiz pause. Questions like, "Is it always this quiet here?" Or, "Why didn't you hate us?" Ruiz tried his best to answer, though he often didn't know the answers himself. A chaplain visited the camp and spent time with both soldiers and children who had been displaced by the war. One evening, he sat with Lucas by the edge of a field, listening more than speaking. Lucas told him about the stories he had been taught, that Americans would burn him alive, that surrender was worse than death. Then he said something that silenced the chaplain completely. "The man I feared the most, he gave me water, and he died because he didn't want to kill me." Word of what happened in the village began to spread. Other units heard about the American sergeant who died protecting a German child. Some dismissed it as propaganda in reverse. Others couldn't stop thinking about it. The story was told in mess halls, passed along in whispers, not as legend but as warning. Mercy, it seemed, was a fragile thing on a battlefield, but unforgettable when witnessed. When the war officially ended, Ruiz helped arrange for Lucas to be placed with a relief organization working to reunite children with surviving relatives. As they prepared to part ways, Ruiz handed the boy a small envelope. Inside was a photograph. Sergeant Hendricks standing with his 2 children in front of a cabin in Michigan, smiling into the sun. On the back, in English and rough German, Ruiz had written, "He believed in kindness, so do I." Lucas didn't say much during their final moments together. He simply hugged Ruiz tightly, the way a child clings not to a person, but to safety itself. Then he stepped into the truck and was gone. Ruiz stood watching long after the dust settled. He knew he'd likely never see the boy again, but something had been passed between them, something more enduring than orders or medals. Years later, when Ruiz would sit with his own children and tell them stories of the war, he rarely spoke of gunfire or battlefields. Instead, he told them about a scared boy in a ruined village, about a sergeant who refused to hate, and about a choice made in the final days of chaos, a choice to see a child, not an enemy. For Lucas, that memory lived too. As he grew older, he carried the photograph like a talisman, hidden but never forgotten. He would one day write a short memoir, not about war, but about the moment it ended for him. The moment a dying man chose mercy over vengeance. That moment became the foundation of everything he would later build. And in the quiet space between gunfire and peace, between fear and forgiveness, the voice of Sergeant Hendricks echoed still, not as an order, not as a warning, but as a truth. Even when it costs everything, mercy matters. Because sometimes mercy is the only thing that survives.